Welcome to the Hard 180, where we are counting down the 100 most essential hair metal albums of the 1980s metal scene. Today I'm joined by Chris Epting. I should ask your pronunciation, Chris. Is Epting the proper pronunciation there?
You got it right, Baco. Epting.
All right, man. Whoa, I was starting to sweat there. You're an author of many rock biographies, but most importantly for today's discussion, we're talking the book Adrenalized, Life, Def Leppard, and Beyond with Def Leppard guitarist Phil Collen, obviously. So before we get into today's topic, Chris, when you're working with someone like Phil to write their story, what exactly tell us and the listeners what your role is here.
Well, it really varies depending on who I'm working with. Working with Phil was really stands out for me. It was the first time I ever co-wrote a memoir with anybody, and I've done, I think, about 15 since then. So it really was a learning process for me. I think it was a learning process for Phil. We had an extraordinary amount of help from Phil's wife, Helen, who just organized and just really got a lot of things together. So the three of us kind of worked through it. And for me, it was just about, getting Phil, like I do with anybody. I mean, I've done a lot of memoir work since then, teaching and whatnot, but getting somebody comfortable enough where they're willing to share things that maybe they haven't shared before, or if they have, illuminate it a little bit differently, give us something different people haven't heard before. And Phil's story I always found fascinating. I got to know him as a journalist. Had written a lot about Phil. We became friends, Phil, Helen, and myself, and we were driving to a show at one point. And I said to him, we should write your story just out of the blue. And he was sort of intrigued by it. And he goes, "Do you think anybody would really care about it?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I think a lot of times these guys, to them, it's not that special. It's just their life.
Right.
It's what they do." And I had watched him at that point in a lot of different scenarios, and I said, "No, this is not what most people go through in life." And his story, again, I always found personally interesting because of what he came out of in England in the '70s. That he was so into punk and glam and was in a band called Girl and all these really intriguing things that got him to Def Leppard.
Were you much of a fan of Def Leppard when you met him?
Oh yeah, yeah. I liked Def Leppard from way back. I mean, I always appreciated them. I always thought of a lot of the bands that came out of that era, that kind of and first initial MTV era. They were one of my favorites. I mean, I thought they were just, I don't know, there was something about, I mean, I love the songs, obviously, but I always liked the presentation. I remember seeing the Hysteria tour when it came around and loved that. I thought that was very innovative. They obviously had a great catalog at that point to draw from, but the staging was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciated that. And I just always liked them. I mean, again, I liked how they adapted as times changed, and how they dealt certainly with adversity always impressed me. Whether it was an injured band member or the loss of a band member, I mean, they went through a lot that a lot of
Mm-hmm.
bands didn't go through, and that always, to me, they had a great humanity about them. That, in addition to the music, they just seemed like good guys, and they are. I mean, I got to through Phil, of course. You've got there'd be plenty of instances where you'd be with the other guys, and they're amazing. I mean, they really are funny and down to earth and engaged. Aside from being monstrously talented, they're just good guys.
You mentioned that you kind of met Phil through your work. Was it as a writer?
Yeah,
Do you have a background in rock journalism then?
I did. Yeah, I mean, I still do to a degree. As a music journalist, I wrote about everybody for years, and I spoke to everybody, and I photographed a lot. I was really very immersed in that for a long time, and I loved it. I mean, as a fan, I loved it because even though you'd be writing a story, it was always fun to get to know certain artists and really kind of ask questions you always wanted to know as a fan. And that was certainly fun. And then when you get to know people personally, if you write a book with somebody, you know them inside and out. I mean, there's no
Mm-hmm.
way around it. They do become like family, and that was certainly the case with Phil and Helen. And they became good family friends, our families. I mean, they became and are part of our lives, and that was really a lot of the process of just spending day after day, week after week, working on his book.
Anytime somebody kind of sits, especially someone in the spotlight, tells their own story, there's typically stuff that people who know them realize that you missed a few things that you probably didn't want to get out there. Were there any kind of like You don't have to be, although I'll take it. But were there conversations like, well, I probably don't want to talk about that in the book?
What I've learned in working with, whether it's Phil or the Doobie Brothers or John Oates or whoever, there are always things that are very sensitive spots, and you don't have to put them in the book. Mm-hmm. But when you're working with someone like that, it helps to know what that is, because oftentimes there's something behind it that can go in the book, and you just have to get to it. So you've got to work through sometimes some details and stories that may just be nobody's business, but beyond it, it's connected to other things that may be relevant in the book. So, and that's where trust comes into play. You know, you work with somebody like that, you become their shrink, you become their sound, or you become all these different things, you know, and I respect that. And I don't, we'll never talk out of school about anybody, but that said, when you're writing a book, you want some good stories. You want things that are going to, make people really get an insight into what your life is like. So striking that balance is always a big challenge.
How much of the work was done like in person, face to face, like working directly with him?
Well, I mean, Phil, we don't live far apart. So thankfully, most of it was done in person. So if he was on the road, we would have calls and things. But more often than not, I'd get in my car, head down to the house, and we would just spend day after day having conversations outside on their patio. And just Helen would be there. We kind of roundtable things for what she was aware of. And again, she was great with research and different memories and things. And I would talk to other people at Phil's request, other band members and things, to kind of get their perspectives. But it was very hands-on, most of it in person. And that's the best case scenario for working on a book like that, is being with the person. Because then you're reading their body language, you're really getting to know them. There's just those little subtleties that you get in person that you don't get otherwise.
Would he wear a shirt typically?
Usually. Unless he came out of a workout in the garage or something. He was usually, I'll tell you that for me, the best part would be watching Phil just noodling on his guitar at home, on his couch, just working things out, trying different things, just messing around with a little amp. And because he's such an amazing player, and but we're used to that image of Phil on stage, that when you see him just at home on a couch when he's investigating things and experimenting, it was always very exciting to see that.
And what is quite possibly even a more absurd question, does the similarity of his name to Phil Collins ever come up in the book or in your personal conversations?
Well, not so much with him, but when I would tell people who you're working with, and I'd say, we love Genesis. I mean, but he's used to it too. I mean, what are the odds that names would be that similar? But I would get it once in a while from people just when they would hear the name, and I would explain. But I think he probably gets it once in a while. But where I was with him, if it was backstage at a Dev show, you were amongst people that knew who he was,
of course.
So there was no mystery.
I said it was an absurd question. Ryan Adams probably runs into a lot of that too.
Absolutely.
Well, you've done a lot of other books. I saw like Tesla's Brian Wheat was one of them. Dave Mason, Leif Garrett. You mentioned John Oates. So it sounds like from what you just told me, that the Phil Collen book was kind of like the first domino, and you kind of becoming a co-writer du jour?
That was the first one that Phil taught me so much about how you do it. And then it became a calling card. I could say, when I was talking to John Oates, similar circumstance, we'd become friends through my journalistic exploits around him. And we talked about it. And I said, I did this book with Phil Collen. That impressed John. John was well aware of Phil, of course. And it helps when someone like Phil puts their trust in you. Then that speaks a lot, and that really came in handy moving forward. And I'll always be very grateful to Phil for that. And
it sounds like you still stay in touch with him pretty regularly.
Going to see him. I don't know whenever this runs. In 3 days, they'll be in San Diego, and I'll see him in a few nights. And I saw him right before the tour started, at their child's birthday party. So yeah, we're very much in touch. And like I said, Phil and Helen are family to me, and I hope they always will be. They really are. They're just apart from being interesting, colorful personalities, both of them, they're just decent people. They're just good people that are smart and compassionate and very nice to hang around with.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, they were just here right around the time when you and I started emailing about setting this up, and they kind of did a few things. It was about a week. It's actually the same weekend of Metallica, and they both
Right.
My point is, Def Leppard was here for a few days. They were just doing things around the community, going to record stores and giving away tickets, signing records and stuff. So
Well,
it's
again,
kind
they're
of
good guys. They're still fans of music. They're it's funny. They still, that part of them I think really resonates, where they're into music, and they like hunting things down and listening to things, chasing down rarities. They're fans in a way, not in a way of what they grew up with. You can talk Bowie and Ian Hunter and Mott the Hoople with Phil and Joe all day long, and bring things up. And when I interviewed Joe for the book, who was very helpful, and we would end up talking about the New York Dolls a lot, which he's a big fan of, and so am I. And
okay.
I could send him any rare New York Dolls thing, and he was really hungry for that. So again, these guys are they love music through and through, not just their own, but they're still fans in a lot of ways of what they grew up with.
Well, I appreciate that, and I really like the fact that I like when these bigger artists are doing something where they're kind of leaving an imprint on the community while they're there. They're not just showing up doing the show and getting out. And both Metallica and them did that. Metallica had a nice little wide thing. We're not talking about Metallica today, but it was all timed around the same thing. So that was really cool to see, all these stories of them just popping up in neat little places.
We live in a good time that these bands are touring on the level they are. Great bands like this that make summer, and remind us of the magic of getting out and watching great kind of festival style gigs like this. And to me, I'm probably older than you, but growing up in the 70s, there were you'd go to stadium shows. There were things called like the World Series of Rock, and it'd be like Aerosmith, REO, Boston, Rick Derringer, Ted Nugent, all in one thing, but no screens. Like you'd go,
Right.
and it wasn't really about, because if you were at the 50-yard line, you couldn't really see much of anything. It was more the communal spirit of it. Today,
Right.
of course, there's great production, but I think bands, tours like this, to me, they harken back to those great communal events where it was an event, and the music was the mainstay, but you would just have all these great things happening in the crowd, and it really is a nice throwback.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, you're a little older than me, but Monsters of Rock. Do you remember that tour with Van Halen, Scorpions? That was the first big stadium show I got to see.
That was a great one.
Yeah. Well, today we are talking about the 80s. I have you're a welcome guest on the Hard 180, where we, like I said, we're counting down all these records. Let's make it official, Chris. Coming in at number 10 on the Hard 180 is the fourth album from Def Leppard, the 1987 release Hysteria. This was produced by Mutt Lange, who had done the band's basically the previous two records, Pyromania and High and Dry. I think the story leading up to this record is almost as important as the record itself, because it actually tells so much about it. That's kind of why I'm really looking forward to having you on. I got to believe you got some stories from Phil as far as getting into this, but I'll hit the bullet points before I kick it to you. So the Pyromania just blew up. You'll go 6 million. They become everybody knows who they are. Then the thing with Rick Allen, where he gets in a car accident. They end the tour. They're working on the new record. He gets in his accident and loses his arm. The fact that they carried on, without looking at getting a new drummer is baffling. We'll touch on that, I'm sure, at some point. Mutt Lange decides that I've heard a couple different stories. Maybe you clear this up for me, but he either needed a break or he had to produce the Cars record. And so that whole Jim Steinman thing comes in, where it just ends up being a mess. So we can touch on all that. Where do you want to start, basically? That was before they got Mutt Lange back and got everything put together.
The thing about Rick that Phil was always adamant about, and we first got to know each other, even before working on the book, he would say, people always act amazed that we went on with him. And he says, we look at each other like, to us, it was a no-brainer. There was no decision, but he's our mate. Like, we figured, it was going to be figured out. To the guys in Def Leppard, that's big
weird
deal. It's just what you do. And that, to me, speaks to that brotherhood and what those guys are all about. They really, there is that bond that's there that they never thought for a second they weren't going to make that work. And I love that. That, to me, is what sets a band like that apart. So to Phil and the rest of the guys, like, people are always amazed by that. That, to them, it's a no-brainer. It doesn't even chart. It's just you do the right thing. You stick by your guy. If he wants to play and he's going to figure out what to play, we're going to help him and be there for him. And that's what they did.
It is amazing, but I've been in bands and I'm just like, you replace guys for a lot dumber reasons or maybe dumb's not the right word. You know what I mean? Less critical. You know what I mean? So I don't know.
They never thought about it. I mean, what gets me when I think about Hysteria, when you think about how much time went by between the
Yeah.
albums, that's back in the day. People don't remember, I'm sure, that you had an album a year. Boom, it was just like clockwork. Album tour, album tour, album tour. And with Def Leppard, years go by,
Yeah,
and
almost 5.
it's crazy. And that album, it became like an opera of how it got done. And the with Mutt having to go, had the cars thing, and things were taking way longer than they should have been taking, but they did because of the perfectionism and the other issues going on. The Jim Steinman thing I always found kind of funny, because when I was in college, just a brief backstory, in the early 80s, I interned with a guy named Todd Rundgren.
Mm.
And if you know who Todd Rundgren is,
Yep.
and I was a
He
huge
produced
Todd,
the Meatloaf records that Jim Simon's famous for. Yeah.
exactly. And I was and is a huge Todd Rundgren fan. I'd met him in college. I used to do a college radio station. I interviewed him. One thing led to another, and I got to go intern at his studio in Woodstock, New York, for a while. And so that was about 3 years after the Meatloaf record. Meatloaf record, of course, at that point was one of the biggest records in history. I think it still is, that Todd produced. Now, as Phil was talking about it, at some point, somebody in the organization thought that they loved the Meatloaf record. And evidently somebody thought that Steinman had been involved in a lot of the production. Now, he had a hand in it, but it was Todd's record. I mean, it was Todd's record end to end. Steinman played and helped orchestrate and arrange and things like that. But I think when they brought Steinman in, the thought was that he was the Meatloaf guy. He had created that sound. And I think they became aware at a certain point that he wasn't that guy. It wasn't the right fit. And so, of course, it shifted, and they had to get Mutt back in the mix. But the fact that Steinman's even in there, I find so interesting, that he really, I think that was, I think it was a false start, because they had him almost misidentified as to what his role had been, because the Meatloaf record, from a production standpoint, was always held up as like just one of the great productions up until that point, and right up there with things that Mutt Lange was doing. So I think that's why Jim got involved as he did. But they get out of that whole mess, and then of course Mutt comes back. But even things like needing an extra song, and Joe's kicking around a little thing that becomes "Pour Some Sugar on Me," like things that almost didn't happen, and it's, the way just Phil tells the story of how the relationships in the band forged over that long period of time, his relationship with Steve Clark and how integral that was to his life, and what that album is really where a lot of that came together. So the relationships in the band were deeply affected by the length of the album production as well.
And Phil came in on Pyromania, and basically the record was written. I believe I saw an interview where he said he played on basically 5 solos, and that was initially all he was brought in recording wise to do. But they found out he could sing, so he ended up helping out there as well. So this is really his first foray into like basically putting his own stamp on it, and obviously look at the way things turned out.
Well, that's Phil. I mean, Phil, I know when they were doing Pyromania, one of the first things he did was took a cassette, a photograph home, and did a solo. They wanted to give him a solo, which became the solo. I think they knew right away what he was capable of.
Mm-hmm.
But Phil is so explosively creative. When he gets going, he can't shut down. I mean, he just goes off on so many tangents and explorations that I think on Hysteria, it was a good environment for him to do that, because there was a lot of downtime, there was a lot of experimental time, and Phil just fills that time, with playing. And I think for him, the time actually helped him develop things he may not have had it been a very shrunken, truncated schedule.
And it's fun to kind of look back at someone who has a career like him, because I've heard that stuff from Girl, and I would not really like when I listened to it. If I'd heard it prior to him being in Def Leppard, I wouldn't have gone, this guy is going to be something. You know what I mean? And that's not to take anything away from him, but that to me as a fan is the fun thing, to see the progression in an artist. And honestly, even with Def Leppard, you go High and Dry, Pyromania, Hysteria, the change that they grew through there is really fun to listen to.
It's incredible. And again, to me, Phil is a very rare hybrid artist, because you've got his love of things like the Sex Pistols, And then you've got things, the Queen and the Motley Hoople. And Phil, I think, taps into all those things. He's got the raw, gritty Pistols thing, and then he's got the grand operatic Queen thing. He's got so many different dimensions, but out of it comes Phil Collen's own style. He all these things kind of get thrown together, and from it he weaves out his own playing style, which is, I think, very unique and very recognizable.
And from a musician standpoint, I've heard a lot over the years about Mutt Lange's production style, and just how meticulous and how he loves to break things down. I had not realized, like I knew they recorded with a Rockman, which actually before I get to the next thing, I'm going to touch on that. For people younger than me, I guess a Rockman was basically the Walkman was the it's a pun on that, but instead of a cassette player that you carried around, it was a pocket-sized guitar amp that you basically plugged headphones in your guitar in. And I've played through one, and I would not say I was particularly impressed with the audio quality, but that was never really the point of it. And they recorded most of the guitars on this record through that. And I was not aware of that previously. It makes a lot of sense now, but obviously Mutt, not just taking the standard tone out of there, he's modulating and processing stuff a lot. But wow. Because you listen to this record, it's so crazy sounding guitar-wise. I remember even at the time going, what are they even playing? Some of this stuff doesn't even sound like guitar, but it clearly is.
Yeah, and I listened to it recently, and it more than holds up. A lot of the stuff from the 80s, it has an 80s sound to it. To me, Hysteria sounds so bright and so interesting and still a little bit ahead of its time. There's so many good things happening there. Wasn't the Rockman developed by Tom Schultz?
Yes, probably. I meant to mention that too. Yeah, from Boston. Yeah, he ended up doing like a whole line of like outboard gear.
Player that I know Phil likes, who again was so innovative and created tools like that to help players like himself. That's a whole other great story. But yeah, and I think Mutt's style, obviously it's a very unique style. It's it can take longer. It can cost a lot of money. That record cost, what that record was going to have to sell, to make up, everybody knew it was going to be a real challenge, given what the investment was to produce it. But and I think the tour helped it as well, because for anyone who saw that tour, it really was a cool tour. It was a great kind of 360 stage, which not a lot of bands had done at that point. The Stones had done it. I think Yes had done it. But that kind of in the round thing was fairly unique. They would get carted out, kind of like Taylor Swift does today, in a laundry basket, because there was no other way to the stage. So they would get carted out and then secretly put under and then come out. So there were great stories about that tour. But I think the tour helped it, and MTV obviously, it was. I remember Phil telling me that. I mean, it's so long ago, but they could always tell if a city had cable TV by how they reacted to certain songs. If they were watching the Foolin' video, then there'd be a big reaction. But cable wasn't everywhere.
I forget that too. It was like you're very much correct. Like it was rolling around the country at different paces, but
they always knew which markets had cable by the reactions to a lot of the songs. So it was a different age of touring. Different radio was still a huge factor in success of records and things like that. And it was primarily vinyl. I mean, vinyl and cassette at that point, it was pre-CD. So it was a different age, but I mean, obviously the time they put into it, the kind of Frankenstein quality, all the different studios and things, Mutt coming back into it. I mean, it worked. Obviously it paid out and it was worth it and all that. But the story behind that record is fascinating.
I wonder how nerve-wracking it got for them. Did he mention that at all as far as like the money they're piling up before this? They're not even done with the album?
I think the label was more concerned about that. I think as artists, their attitude was, we're going to do what we do. It's rarely the artist that is thinking about the money. It's always like the money guys, the managers, and the record label, of course, was paying for it. But I think the band, they're such perfectionists. They were, whatever it was going to take, they were going to do.
Well, a couple more things on the actual recording process. I also recently read that, like, on that bridge for Hysteria, right when he goes into that, I want to know tonight, those open chords that him and Steve play are actually, they're not chorded. They're, I think most people can relate to, like, you strum a chord. They would just hit the first string and then they would record the next one, and they would layer it. But like
Yeah.
when I read that story, I instantly, my brain went to the sound of those chords right there, and it popped. And I'm like, oh, that's brilliant. And it's
Yeah.
just that next level of thought that Mutt would have, that like, I want to get rid of that the dragging sound. I want a really hard, unique, chord sound. And now I kind of want to go try it myself and see what it sounds like.
And they had Rick's situation as well, that was happening. And so
Right.
you had so many dynamics in terms of how to just make the music. But they took their time. I mean, look, the proof is in the pudding. The record is
Yeah.
obviously a masterpiece and became, I think, for them, still probably the definitive record. When people, as great as all those records are, I think that's the one that people still hold the fondest and nearest and dearest. A lot of kids came of age on that record. And again, MTV, it was such a perfect storm for a band like Def Leppard that could play really well, but that looked good, and then all of a sudden have this story about their drummer, which was, it was a human interest story beyond rock and
Mm-hmm.
roll. That was a very big deal, And again, if you didn't live through it, it's kind of hard to describe just how unique that
For
was.
real. Yeah, I mean, I was. This came out in '87. I graduated '89. Basically, from '87 to '89. I mean, this was, it just got bigger and bigger and bigger through that time.
Yeah, it was. It really, and again, I think of the number of years between albums that today still seems so strange to me. That would have ended a lot of other bands,
Mm-hmm.
but they were young and energetic, and they always function, especially in that Hysteria stage. Phil always described it as like a soccer team almost, where they just cover each other. Everyone's always covering everything. There's
Yeah.
always to look and see where there's a gap on this, and you got to cover that part of the field. But they were very conscious on that tour about putting on a good show, obviously, and there's things you can't control. I mean, pour some sugar. I mean, I think there's a story in the book about a strip club down in Florida that had people
Yeah.
playing it, and one of those stories where I'm sure the record would have found an audience, but that didn't
I think it
hurt,
would have been okay without that. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
those little things that would happen back then that would amplify a record, that doesn't happen as much today.
Well, I've heard it referred to as the national anthem for strippers, to which I thought was, is there a nation of strippers somewhere I'm unaware of?
Quiet secret society.
Yeah, there we go. And yeah, with the drums, like you were talking about Rick Allen, they had to create this whole, basically for the first time ever, and they were added at the very end. And the explanation, I assume Phil said that was because the songs they couldn't have actually evolved the way they did if they did them on the front end. And when you listen to the record, you can actually hear what he's talking about.
Oh, totally. Absolutely. It's yeah. Again, there have been great sonic studies done on that record. A lot of written about it. I think there was a book written about it, about breaking it down. Because even to this day, I think it stands as a fairly unique production, given all that was going on, given the experimenting and the adventurous techniques they were using. I don't think there's really another record quite like it.
And 5 months to mix it. Now, did Phil talk to you at all about like what it was like? Because you spend 3+ years doing this thing. You're kind of creating a new way to record something. And what was it like for him to finally hear his first mix? Did you ever get into that?
I think he was blown away as he described
I would
it.
imagine.
He didn't know what to expect, and I think he was absolutely blown away by what the results were. How could you not be? It was just. I think at that point, none of them knew what to expect.
Now, when the album came out, now I really loved Pyromania, but I was kind of a victim of that 5 year funk. I'd moved on to a lot of other bands,
Yeah.
And I was just it came out, and the first single, I believe the American release was it was Woman. For some reason in my head, Women was the first
Yeah.
single, and I was like, it's okay, I don't get it. And even Animal came after that, but it was really.
It
I don't.
took a little while. It took a
Yeah.
little while.
Yeah,
And
as big as that's a good point. As big as this record is, it didn't blow up like
no,
out of the gates.
no, I think some fans had moved on. Music is starting to change a bit at that point. It's not quite what happens in the late '80s, but That's a long time to be off the charts and off the radio with new stuff. But it took a while. But again, it's I think it's the thing. I think it grows on you. I think that's what gives it its staying power. It's not instantaneous. It's very complex. I think it's way more layered than meets the ear when you first listen to it. There's a lot going on there.
I couldn't agree more. It was the Sugar single, Pour Some Sugar on Me, when that came out. That I know that was when I kind of paid a little more attention to it. That was probably around the time I ended up getting it. And then, I mean, Love Bites and Hysteria are probably two of the better ballads from this entire
Oh
decade.
yeah,
So,
absolutely. Well, that's the thing too. Is it got you stylistically? There was a lot on that record from rock, heavy rock, harder rock, metallic rock, mid tempo ballads. It was very complete. There was a lot there to choose from, which of course appeals to different audiences. And you had the videos for Sugar, the live one, and then the concept one. So they were pulling great footage off the Hysteria tour. They had a lot to work with visually at that point.
yeah, and I believe they're even in my yearbook, Chris. I'm not lying. They didn't swing by Owatonna, Minnesota, to hang out. It was just they were just so. I don't know. It was them and Bon Jovi. Really, they were just like that scene in.
That was it. That was it at that time. And again on the tour, there was a lot of focus on Rick. People were curious just what that
Yeah.
was like, and again, the human interest. It was very. There was a lot of drama, and incredible music, obviously, and I think when at that point as well, the Steve and Phil thing, that bonding has really kicked in on stage, and they become such a dynamic force together, on that tour especially. Um, and yeah, there's just again, it was the perfect storm, I think, for that band to have that record at that time in culture with MTV, where it was at that moment, looking the way they did. With and the Mutt Lange story, that became a story too. That became like an industry story. So everybody was talking Def Leppard at a certain point after that record came out.
Absolutely, and it really. I'm kind of glad that I kind of got to grow up in this scene and kind of experience all that stuff because the phenomenon aspect of it is a little, I mean, we see it now, but it's just different, I guess.
It's totally different. I mean, look, anything pre-internet is really different. I think you had to work harder. Bands had to be out on the road. You didn't have the internet or social media to fall back on. You had to be out playing, really, if you were going to make it happen. And the fact that they invested what they did in their show, I mean, they had one of the best stage shows of that era, and there were some good shows then. Motley, there were bands doing big shows, but Def Leppard, everything got jacked up a notch behind Pyromania, or Hysteria rather. And I remember I saw that tour. I saw it twice actually, and I was blown. It was so entertaining. It was a very smart show. The pacing of it was great. It looked great. It was one of my favorite tours of all time.
And it should be mentioned that they were actually going to bring along a drummer to fill in for
Yeah.
Rick if things didn't work out right away. The famous story, maybe you know the name, but he showed up late, and basically they decided they didn't need him after that.
I can't think of his name. I think it's in the book.
Status quo is the
Yeah, but again, if you think back to what they were going through, they had to have a fallback. And
Oh, of course, yeah.
Nobody knew. No one had done this before. So they were flying blind in a lot of ways, and in a way, kind of innovating for other artists after how you deal with stuff like that. And they didn't. I don't know that they had big band meetings about it. I just think they did what was right by their buddy. That was the whole thing. Is we're going to make it work for him. We're going to figure it out. And they did. But yeah, they were just doing so many different things then on that tour. I think it's one of the great tours of the '80s. I really do.
It just kind of speaks to the curiosity you touched on about just Rick himself. I remember from my own end, maybe it's a little morbid, but just the first photos of the band that came out, like what are they doing? And for the longest time they did kind of like shield that shoulder and stuff, but not really so much anymore. I think we all figured it out. But
what's funny is the band never paid attention to it. It was always they focused on the music, what they were doing. The band never made a big deal out of it, and they still don't. They were just, they just did what they did. They just rolled.
I think it's such an amazing thing to overcome, and the way they do. I would be on the side of like maybe you can go ahead and talk about it more. It's pretty impressive.
About which part? The
Oh, just
I just got to
with
know, just so you know, Phil's wife Ellen texted me. That's what I'm looking at.
oh,
So
tell her Baco says hey.
let me just tell her something really quick.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, what was the question? I'm sorry about that.
I was just saying, like, it really it's such an amazing thing to overcome. It really is monumental. I would be okay with them talking about it more because not just the fact that they kept Rick around, but like the fact that they reinvented. They basically came up with a new way to play drums. I mean, he
Totally,
did probably more than them,
which
but
affected their live sound, which affected their studio sound. Phil always thought it made them a better band in a weird way. Like it
yeah,
gave them this unique edge, and uh, but they never. I love that they never made a big deal about it. They never said anything. They never wasn't showing sympathy. They helped him when he needed it. But even watching them all together, when I was writing the book and stuff, you'd see it where they're just, it's really not to them. It's not a big deal. Everybody else reacts to it, but not the band.
cool. You mind if we do a quick track by track? I'll just go down the order. You tell me your thoughts. All right, the album opens up with "Women."
I remember that being a single. I love that song. I mean, I thought that was a strong single. I still like seeing it live. I don't know if it's in my top 10 of Def Leppard songs. Certainly top 20. But I like it. I mean, I haven't checked out. Have you seen this tour, this run yet, or?
No, I have not. I haven't seen Def Leppard since '98. Is that the album that had "Promises I Can't Keep" on it?
I think so. Oh my goodness,
Yeah.
that's a long time.
Hey, I'm
Gotta get
dedicated
you
to the
out
scene.
there.
I'm not. You know what? Next summer, I'll tell you what. Because of you, I'm gonna go.
Okay, good.
They're gonna do something. I assume they've been. It seems like it's an annual thing now.
Always, always.
All right.
But no, I like Women. I think it's. I remember like I actually had the single. Like this is when you could buy a single, and I think "Tear It Down" was the B side.
Okay.
I remember going to the record store to get that in New York City, where I lived.
I think you're right. And let's touch on that real quick because they had the 45 sleeves, and I heard confirm or deny this, but if you put them together, they make the album cover, but they only released 7. They need to do 2 more, and
I believe that's true.
Yeah.
I believe that's true.
All right. Well, next track,
the
Rock.
band knows far less about that stuff.
That's yeah, that's actually pretty common. What about the next song, Rocket?
I love Rocket. I remember whatchamacallit. There's a Lou Reed connection to because Joe loves Lou Reed, and I remember reading about the fact that there's a little lyrical nod in there in the middle, in that break in the middle, to Satellite of Love. I think Rocket's a great song. It's definitely a little different. It's a very untraditional Def Leppard song. I think that it's got kind of an Adam Ant flavor, those drum beats and things, but I like it.
Okay. Yeah, definitely kind of a outside the box song for them, but a lot of that you can say about the stuff on this record, I guess. Then we got Animal.
Animal. I mean, again, I will tell you, there's not a record, not a song on here that I don't like.
Okay.
Some more than others. I like Animal a lot. I think this to me is very classic Def Leppard of this time. I was trying to think of Jim Steinman's production on this, but I know this was one of the songs he was working on.
Okay.
I remember Phil telling me about that. But I think it's a great song. I mean, I don't know if they're playing that live right now, but they, it's. I remember thinking, it kind of reminded me of the Police a little bit. Again, there was so much happening musically in the '80s that had little similarities. A lot of stuff coming out of England that reminded me of. But no, I like Animal very much.
And Love Bites, I already kind of tipped my hand. I think it's one of the better power ballads of the decade.
I absolutely agree. And it's funny, the '80s for me, that's the decade for power ballads. And I would put Love Bites, I mean, top 5 easily. It's, I know that song, I think Mutt that brought that to the band originally, and before they worked on it. And I think it's a brilliant ballad.
And it doesn't sound like you're going to agree with my take on this. Maybe it's a hot one. I absolutely loved Pour Some Sugar in Me at the time, but over the years, this song has not aged well for me.
Why not?
It just sounds kind of, I don't know. It's probably the only song on here that I think sounds dated. And I'm like, and I just, it's probably more fatigue than anything, because I got to tell you,
I was going to say, there are certain songs, whether we're talking Bohemian Rhapsody or Stairway to Heaven, we know they're good songs, right? Mm-hmm. But we also know that we've heard them to such a point. It's almost hard to be objective because the world makes you sick of it. You know what I mean? It's like you can, when there's no getting away from it, it's hard. I mean, I love the song, but I don't have to hear it every day. You know what I mean? I know it so well. I like some of the deeper cuts on it, but an album like this, there really are not that many quote deep cuts. It's all pretty popular because they were playing most of it. But I still like it. I mean, again, an anthem like this, you know, it's hard to get around. There are certain songs, I think about certain Bon Jovi tunes. It's like, you know, you hear You Could Love a Bad Name. Are you sick of it? Yeah. It's a great song. Yeah. They're just, you have to accept that you're going to get tired of it at some point.
And a lot of this stuff too, if I'm in a live show, all these rules go out the window. You know, I mean, when Kiss plays Rock and Roll Night, that's the one time I want to hear it. You know what I mean? So I get that too. But
exactly, no, it's got to be part of the mix. But you know, through no fault of the band, it's been shoved down our throats and into our ears for years.
I would gladly take the royalties of that song even today.
Yes.
So, the next track, Chris, is the only song on here I don't like and never did. Armageddon It.
What don't you like about it?
It just never clicked with me. I think the pun isn't very good.
Yeah.
I just
a little punny. You know, I get that. I like it. I mean, I would say it's not one of my favorites on the record. I do like the kind of T-Rex flavor to it. At least that's what it always reminded me of. Again, knowing the band likes T-Rex. But I think, I mean, look, there's, you know, they all can't be classics. I mean, I think it's good, but not one of my favorites on the album.
That's cool. I love the next song. And the side 2 opens up with Gods of War, one of my favorites still in this record.
Brilliant. It totally holds up. Never really got overplayed. I think actually the next 2 songs I would put in that category where they're little kind of sleeper tunes for Def. Because again, you know, what happened with Love Bites and Sugar and Hysteria on this record, it's the other songs suffer by comparison just because they didn't get the treatment. But I think it's a brilliant song.
Yeah, and it's, you know, to just that point alone, the fact that this thing had 7 singles, you know, they all had varying level of success, but if you were paying attention to the music at the time, you knew them all.
Absolutely. And this is, again, back in the day where you'd play an album, you'd play a cassette, mm-hmm. You know, you'd play everything in your car, an 8-track, I think we still had at that point. So it wasn't today clicking around. You let things just go.
Sure. Well, you mentioned it. I think Don't Shoot Shotgun is a sleeper on this record. I love it.
I do too, man. Very solid song. To me, it had hit potential, and I was kind of curious why that didn't rise. But again, when you have that many singles, but I love that song.
This is the song that harkens back to Pyromania the most to me. Like, I think you could put this one on that record.
Run Riot?
No. Don't Shoot Shotgun.
Yeah, totally.
Run Riot is another fun one.
A lot of fun. I mean, again, Run Riot is a kind of song that I think gets overshadowed by some of the hits. Mm-hmm. It's if it was another band song, it would be their best song on the album. You know, super catchy, great song, great energy. But when you've got these monsters surrounding it, it's tough to stand out.
Well, have you heard the song Hysteria before?
I've heard it a couple times.
This is right up there with Love Bites to me.
Oh, totally. I loved when they toured with Kiss a number of years ago. And when they would do Hysteria, they would weave the Kiss ballad Beth into the back end of it. The chorus,
I got to look that up on YouTube.
It really fit. It was just a little ride out with Beth, and as a little homage to Kiss. It was beautiful, and it did fit. It was nice.
Phil struck up a bit of a relationship with Paul Stanley on that tour, if I ever recall.
Yeah, Phil went out and actually, I think was only the first or second guy to play wearing jeans gear, put on jeans boots, and went out and played on Goose and Strutter. I was there.
Right on. Excitable. It's an okay tune, but, you know, now we're getting to the more forgettable part for me.
Yeah, I like Excitable okay. I like the next one a little bit more. I think Love and Affection to wrap the record is good. You know, again, it's a solid song. but in the shadow of songs like Sugar, Love Bites, Rocket, and Animal, it's tough. I mean, there's always going to have to be some variance.
It is a weird way to close a record like this, but it's actually extremely effective.
I agree.
Did you talk with Phil much about the sequencing of it? Because I don't think there's a better sequence to it.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Mutt had a lot to do with that. Back again, when you had albums and a side A mattered versus side B, there really was a lot of thinking of where you would put the single, and do you lead with a single? There was all this strategy that would go into the record business back then. So I think Mutt had a lot to do with that, but don't quote me.
Well, it sounds like, based on what we just went through here, you maybe don't have necessarily a favorite. But do you have a favorite song on this record?
Either the title track. It's tough. I mean, it really kind of depends on mood. I'm looking at the list now, and it's like, I love Rocket. I really like Women. I mean, I love this record, but I'd probably say the title track or Love Bites.
Okay,
I mean,
fair enough.
I like their ballads. I do. It's easy to kind of go with something heavier, but their ballads, I thought, always had really nice touch and real kind of sensitive chord things going on. I always loved their ballads.
Yeah, longtime listeners of this show sometimes accuse me of being a hater of any ballad. It'll surprise them to hear it. I'm with you right there. It's one of those two for me is my favorite on here.
Nice.
Yeah. So, what about a favorite Def Leppard record? Is it this one?
I like Slang a lot. I mean,
wow.
I do.
Wow.
I like Slang a lot. I think I would lean Hysteria, for all the reasons we're talking about. Not the least of which is that where I was in life at that time. I was still lived in New York. I was getting ready to move to California. There was a lot going on in life. And that was just one of those albums that became the cliche of sort of the soundtrack of that moment of your life. So I have an emotional attachment to it that's different than the other records. And
that is huge.
And I think seeing the show a couple of times, I loved that era of the band. I just thought they could do no wrong at that point.
Yeah, you don't get a lot of people saying, dropping that in there, but we're at the part of the show now, Chris, where I get to the numbers. So this came in at number 10 on the list of 100, the Def Leppard record, Hysteria. It had an average rank of 22.55556, a high rank at number 8, a low rank of number 68, and I personally ranked it at number 19. Obviously, you didn't rank 100 records for me in preparation for this, but ballpark where you'd throw this in the 80s scene.
In the 80s of what cat?
So we're talking hair metal. We include like Bon Jovi, Poison, Motley Crue, Dokken, Rat, Cinderella, that kind of stuff. So,
well, for me, I mean, look, I'm a little biased, all right?
Yeah, a little bit.
For me, in the 80s, it's top 5 for me, certainly. It absolutely is. I'm trying to think of what's. Now, again, you're not putting Van Halen in there, right?
No Van Halen, no AC/DC, no Aerosmith. Kiss gets in just because they really steered into the hair metal.
Yeah, that's true. I'd have to look. What were some of the other? I mean, I got to refresh my hair metal.
1 second.
I mean, where does Whitesnake fall in there?
Yeah, Whitesnake. Where did they end up here? I'll confirm any ranking not in the top 10. The reveal is a big part of the show, Chris. Whitesnake came in at number 33 with their self-titled one, the big '87 record.
What was 1? You can't tell me.
I bet you can guess.
What would it
the
be?
weird thing about number 1, and maybe I can't leave that in. No, I'll tell you what. When we're off air, I'll tell you. Okay. I don't mind sharing it with you, but yeah, just anybody listening to this, I was about to give a pretty big clue. But honestly, I think 8 out of 10 would probably guess what it is anyway. We're now at the top 10. We're kind of anybody that's followed up to this point know what's left. There's a Def Leppard record that I think people expected to be on this list that we haven't talked about as of this episode, so they can figure that's coming up. I don't think I'm breaking too much ground there, but Chris, I really appreciated your time. I caught you on Decibel Geek years ago. You guys were talking about, I believe, Kiss Destinations, and I just remember.
That.
Okay, I remember thinking, like, that'd be a guy if I could be good to get on the show at some point. And then when I was researching I got to get some Def Leppard guy. I'm not going to get somebody in the band, but,
Right.
and then I'm like, I saw that you co-wrote the book. I instantly thought about that. I'm like, I'm going to at least reach out. So I really appreciate.
Dude, I'm so glad you reached out. I remember that Kiss thing well. I'm a big Kiss fan, and I had written a book about Kiss, and had done a lot of writing about Kiss, and got to know those guys a bit. And around that time, yeah, I was going to all the different Kiss locations related. Right?
That was a really fun episode. One of the first. I don't know if I knew Chris yet or not. It was right around the time that I was pulled on board to the Decibel Geek group. But
It's a good crew. I have to tell you, I like the Decibel Geek brand. I like the crew.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate conversations like this because you guys are smart. You're fans, but you're really educated and you're passionate. You know what you're talking about. Always a great conversation.
Couldn't appreciate that more. And of course, thank you again for your time. Anybody wants to check out any of the myriad of wonderful books Chris has done, you can go to chrisepting.com. I'll obviously have a link in the show, but if you got Google, just type it in. You're going to find it as fast as I did. Chris, any other plugs you want to throw in?
No, man, that sounds great. I appreciate the time to chat about this stuff. I'm around anytime if I can be of any other service. Baco, you got my information. We're friends, so let's stay in touch.
All right, buddy. And then, so hang on just a second before I let you go. And for the listener, here is your moment of Lee.